Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
They told me distance makes the heart grow fonder, but no one ever warned me what happens when that distance is filled by someone who looks like the man you love, talks like him, and carries the same last name. The morning Evan left for deployment felt heavier than any storm I'd ever stood through. The sun hadn't even risen when he put his duffel bag by the door, the smell of coffee and rain mixing with the silence that always comes before goodbye. He hugged me long enough for me to think he might not let go, then said the same line he always did before leaving for duty: "You're stronger than you think, Em. I'll be home before you know it." Those words sounded safe back then, the kind of promise people make when they still believe the world is fair. I didn't know that by the time he came back, our home would feel like a stranger's house and my life would have someone else's fingerprints all over it. Evan's brother, Mark, was the one who drove me home after the send-off ceremony. He was the opposite of Evan in almost every way: louder, sharper, with a grin that always lingered half a second too long. We'd never been close, but he'd always been part of the family, showing up for birthdays, barbecues, the usual events where politeness is mandatory and emotions stay surface level. That day, though, he seemed different, warmer, almost gentle. He told me Evan asked him to look out for me, which sounded innocent enough. I even thanked him. The ride home was quiet except for the sound of the wipers scraping across the windshield and Mark saying, almost casually, "You know, Em, he's lucky. Not every guy gets a wife who can handle this kind of thing." I laughed it off, pretending I didn't notice the way he glanced at me from the driver's seat. The first few weeks alone weren't easy, but they were manageable. I filled my days with work and calls from Evan whenever he could find a decent connection. His voice through the static was enough to keep me sane. Mark stopped by once in a while, dropping off groceries, fixing things around the house, offering to help with anything I needed. At first, I thought he was being kind, even thoughtful. Evan's parents praised him endlessly for stepping up. They called him a blessing. I wanted to believe that too. But kindness can start to feel heavy when it's wrapped in too much familiarity. One night, about a month after Evan left, Mark brought over takeout. I was too tired to cook, and the gesture felt harmless enough. We sat in the kitchen, eating in silence until he started asking questions, personal ones. How was I sleeping? Did I ever get lonely? Did I trust Evan's team to keep him safe? His tone was soft, too soft, and when I hesitated, he said, "I just worry about you. You're practically family to me." That word, practically, sat wrong in my stomach. I told myself I was overreacting, that he was trying to help, but something about his concern felt rehearsed, like he already knew how I'd answer. By the second month, Mark's visits had become part of my routine. He'd show up with little things: flowers from his mother's garden, leftovers from family dinners, even small repairs I never asked for. He started leaving things behind: a tool, a jacket, a mug. Each time I'd find something of his in the house, he'd laugh and say, "Guess I'm turning into a regular around here." I'd smile, but inside I felt something shift, a sense of being watched, managed, and quietly studied. He began to comment on the smallest things, like how I wore my hair, or how I'd started using Evan's old hoodie as pajamas. Once, he joked, if I didn't know better, I'd think you miss me instead of him. I told him that wasn't funny. He smiled like he didn't believe me. Evan's parents didn't help. They encouraged Mark's presence, saying he reminded them of Evan. "He makes the house feel alive again," his mother told me one afternoon over coffee. "It's comforting to see him around you. It feels like a piece of Evan's spirit is still here." I wanted to tell her that the comfort she saw was starting to feel more like intrusion, but I stayed silent. There's a certain loneliness that comes with being the wife of a soldier. You learn to swallow things before they turn into noise. The first real boundary was crossed one evening in early spring. I had just come home from work, exhausted, when I saw Mark in the backyard fixing a loose board on the fence. He hadn't asked. I walked out to thank him, and he stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead with that same grin he always wore. He said, "Evan always talked about how you hated that fence." I figured I'd finally do something about it. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and added, "You deserve someone who notices things." I froze. The air between us changed. I laughed awkwardly, told him he should probably head home, and he nodded, still smiling. As he left, he said, "Don't worry, Em. I'll take care of you like Evan would." It was such a simple sentence, but it didn't sound brotherly anymore. It sounded like a promise from someone who didn't know where the line was or didn't care. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words, wondering if I'd imagined the undertone or if he'd been building toward this all along. When I told Evan about Mark helping out, he laughed it off, said, "That's just Mark being Mark. You know how he is." I wanted to say no, I don't think I do anymore, but I stayed quiet because what good is suspicion when the person who should hear it is half a world away? By the time I finally drifted off to sleep, I knew one thing for sure. Mark's concern wasn't about kindness or family. It was about control, quiet, careful control. And though I didn't know it yet, that single sentence, "I'll take care of you like Evan would," wasn't just a warning. It was a foreshadowing of everything that was about to break. When the calls thinned into static and the days unspooled like a roll of tape that kept snagging on the same jagged edge, I told myself that loneliness was just a long hallway and that if I kept walking I would eventually find a door. Yet the truth was far less poetic because the hallway turned out to be my own house with Mark moving through it like he had a key I never gave him, dropping in with small errands and big opinions and an ease that made me wonder how long he had practiced the part of the dependable brother who does not ask for anything while his eyes take inventory of everything. Evan still called when he could, and those calls stitched me together just enough to get through the week. But there were stretches when the connection clipped so hard I could hear only his breathing and the line's hollow ocean, which meant my answers had to be cheerful and compact. The way you talk to someone at an airport gate when boarding is already underway, and it is exactly in those little gaps, those "we'll catch up next time" gaps, where Mark learned to plant himself like a flag. He arrived with a cracked smile politeness that would play beautifully on a church committee, holding grocery bags or a toolbox as if props alone proved intention. And while I knew there was kindness in action, I also knew that kindness has a shape, and this shape was getting broader every visit, because it expanded into decisions I hadn't asked him to make and conversations I wasn't ready to have. And then it crept into objects, his jacket on the back of Evan's chair, his coffee mug beside the sink, his phone charging on my kitchen counter like he lived here but forgot the courtesy of admitting it. I kept telling myself to be grateful, to let people help, to avoid the stubborn pride that leaves you stranded on the side of the road with a flat tire and a lesson. But there is a difference between help that steadies you and help that steadies the person giving it. And after a while I couldn't ignore the way Mark's questions slid under my door jamb at night, how I was sleeping, what I feared most about the deployment, whether I ever felt like the silence itself was a kind of answer from the universe. On a Thursday that started with rain and ended with heat, he came by with takeout and a lopsided grin, said he was just checking, then leaned against the stove while we ate and asked if I trusted the guys on Evan's team to have his back. And when I answered with a tired yes, the kind of yes that means please stop digging, he said he only asked because family should be honest, which would have been fine if his definition of honest didn't include inching closer than people who are not lovers should ever stand, and if it didn't include the kind of eye contact that feels like a hand on your wrist. His phone lit on the counter while he was reaching for plates, and I didn't mean to look, but the screen flashed a text from his mother that read like a medal pinned on his chest. "You're a good man for looking after her. Evan would be proud." And it was the would-be that clanged in my head because it made his care sound like a replacement, a shadow that thinks it is the shape. I am not a saint and I am not an amateur, so I decided to move his shadow into the light where people have to own what they are doing. And while I do not enjoy drama, I have learned that a little well-placed awkwardness can accomplish what a dozen polite hints will never touch, which is why I gathered every item of his he had forgotten: the jacket from Evan's chair, the mug by the sink, the little wrench he left after tightening a hinge that did not squeak, and I arranged them neatly in a cardboard box, wrote "Lost and Found, not your house" on the lid with a black marker, snapped a tidy photo, and sent it in a group text to Mark and his parents with a chirpy caption that looked innocent at first glance and landed like a brick once you read it twice. Returning these to their owner, found scattered around my home, must have wandered in on their own. It was a small revenge, sure, but small revenge has a way of popping exactly the balloon that keeps floating back through the same doorway. Because it forces everyone to say out loud what they have been pretending not to notice, and it gave me the one thing I needed most, which was a record, something dated and shared that said boundaries exist here even if yours are on vacation. Mark arrived faster than I expected, carrying the box like it weighed nothing and his temper like it weighed a ton, saying I had misunderstood everything and that he was only doing what Evan asked, which might have cut me if he had not immediately followed it with a speech about how people talk, about how neighbors see cars and make assumptions, about how optics matter in a small town. And when a man starts arguing optics instead of truth, he's telling you which one he serves. I told him I was grateful for the fence repair and the groceries and the jokes that landed when I needed to laugh, but I did not need a second husband, a live-in hall monitor, or a curator for my grief. And while I said all of that in one long breath without raising my voice, his face tightened into the version of handsome that only shows up for a mirror. He stepped closer, close enough to smell the cologne he saves for holidays, close enough to turn the kitchen into a single question, and he said, with a softness that had nothing gentle in it, that sometimes people who are meant to look out for each other realize they have more in common than they thought, which pretended to be a confession while it auditioned as a proposition. I felt the old anger rise, the one that protects you when politeness has been used against you so often you forget it was supposed to be a gift, and I reached behind me for my phone with a smile that matched his for brightness and not for warmth, opened the group text, and typed a breezy follow-up that announced I had found one more stray item under the bed while cleaning and would he like me to add it to the box for pickup, and the moment the message left my screen his phone buzzed on the counter with the distinctive sound of family reading something they can't unread, which made him flinch a hair's breadth and step back just enough for air to re-enter the room, and I cannot lie, that tiny retreat felt better than any speech I could have given. The doorbell rang before either of us could decide what to say next, and when I opened it, his parents stood on the porch with the kind of careful smiles people wear when they intend to save face and rearrange facts, his mother clutching a pie she had surely baked as a prop for forgiveness, his father staring past me like the answer he wanted was inside my kitchen, and she said, with a sweetness that felt like a verdict, that we needed to talk about how to handle appearances from now on. While behind me Mark cleared his throat and said my name in a tone that sounded less like a question and more like the start of a plan. The moment that everything shifted happened slowly, like water carving a canyon over years, but once it began, there was no turning back. And the quiet invasions of attention that Mark had practiced with such precision transformed into a presence so constant it no longer required permission, and by the time I realized the nature of what was unfolding, I understood that boundaries had already been breached in ways I had refused to see, a realization that came wrapped in subtle gestures and the insinuation of words that could mean nothing or everything depending on how the listener chose to interpret them, and in this house that had once felt like a refuge, the air itself seemed loaded with possibility and threat all at once, leaving me suspended between disbelief and fear. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that no one could manipulate circumstance with such patience, that the months Evan spent overseas were supposed to test our marriage and loyalty, yet here was someone so intimate with the rhythm of my life that the spaces left by his absence were already being measured and filled, as though my thoughts were transparent and my feelings merely objects to be rearranged according to his design. And the idea that I might be complicit in my own vulnerability struck me as both humiliating and terrifying. Mark's attention evolved from seemingly innocuous gestures to carefully timed interventions that made it impossible to distinguish care from intrusion, each visit orchestrated with the precision of someone who understood the psychology of proximity. And every action was layered with plausible explanations that made it impossible to call it anything but concern unless one looked at the entire pattern as a whole, and I began to notice the small changes in my own behavior, the way I unconsciously accommodated him, made excuses for his lingering presence, even welcomed his insight on matters that belonged only to my household and my husband. As if the absence of Evan provided permission for the crossing of lines that no one had drawn in ink but were nonetheless universally understood. One afternoon, I returned from work to find him arranging a stack of mail on the counter, a gesture so innocuous in appearance that it could have been a domestic courtesy, yet it felt invasive because it was done without acknowledgement, without request, as though my ownership of my own space was negotiable, and when he smiled at me, his eyes held the sort of intimacy that belonged to someone who already occupied a place reserved for another. A place marked by commitment and trust, and the knowledge that I was standing in that space alone made me feel simultaneously exposed and enraged. There was a night that stands out above the rest, a night when everything collided in a single moment of reckless transparency, when Mark lingered in the living room after I had set up a late dinner for myself. His presence as unremarkable as a shadow until the weight of it became unmistakable, and he began speaking of Evan in ways that should have belonged only to our conversations as a married couple, mentioning small details of my husband's routines, preferences, and absent worries that no one but Evan or I could have known, and the implication was clear. This knowledge had been gathered not for harmless commentary, but for a purpose that had yet to declare itself in full. And the sense of intrusion was intensified by the casual tone he adopted, the kind of tone that persuades the listener to accept betrayal in the form of companionship. My first instinct was to retreat, to call Evan and demand clarity, to confront him with the danger of his brother's manipulation. Yet the impossibility of reaching him, the distance that had been both physical and emotional, left me suspended in a liminal state, forced to navigate deception and proximity alone, and in that limbo, I discovered the precariousness of trust when it is shared among too many people who believe they are entitled to dictate its limits. The betrayal solidified in the days that followed, an emotional usurpation so carefully crafted that no outward evidence could have proved it to an outsider, yet its effects were undeniable, altering every interaction within the household, reshaping the narrative of my life without my consent, and when Evan returned unexpectedly, the signs were already in place, rumors murmured by neighbors, subtle implications caught on social media, and Mark's performance of concern now reframed as evidence of intimacy, all layered in such a way that the credibility of my own perceptions was questioned even by those who claimed to care, including Evan himself, whose silence in the face of orchestrated circumstances felt like both disbelief and betrayal, leaving me to navigate the collapse of my marriage while simultaneously maintaining the outward appearance of composure, the only shield I could wield against a manipulation so sophisticated it resembled inevitability. By the time the confrontation was unavoidable, I had learned to observe every movement, every glance, every choice of words as a potential strategy, and I recognized that the very family that had praised Mark's attentiveness had been complicit, their encouragement of his presence a tacit endorsement of the manipulation that would fracture my home, and when the moment came for him to overstep fully, I realized it was not only a personal betrayal, but a demonstration of the way loyalty can be weaponized, leaving the intended victim paralyzed between outrage, disbelief, and the stark awareness that those who are supposed to uphold love and respect may instead serve their own desires at the expense of truth. An awareness that would ultimately set the stage for the quiet, calculated response that I began to craft even as the foundations of my life shook under the weight of deceit and duplicity. When Evan returned, the house felt smaller, constricted, as though the walls themselves had conspired with Mark to hold me in a place that was no longer my own, and the air was thick with unspoken judgments, half-truths, and the weight of expectation that comes when family decides who deserves compassion and who is tasked with erasing their mistakes, leaving me to navigate a labyrinth of appearances where kindness and complicity were indistinguishable and where every smile could hide betrayal. Every word could carry an accusation, and every gesture could be used as evidence in the court of their approval. Evan had changed in subtle ways, hardened at the edges by the distance of his service and softened in other ways by a vulnerability he could not yet articulate, and yet he seemed reluctant to confront what had happened, perhaps out of disbelief, perhaps out of a desire to preserve a version of reality that included everyone but the truth, and it was in that fragile space of denial and propriety that Mark moved with the ease of someone who knew he had already claimed his advantage, occupying rooms and moments with a familiarity that belonged to no one but him. His parents were complicit in ways that made my blood run cold, offering admonishments masked as guidance, smiles that contained veiled threats, and words that demanded reconciliation under the guise of family loyalty. All while never acknowledging the depth of Mark's manipulations, the subtlety of the emotional coercion, or the way he had constructed a narrative in which my reactions could be painted as overreactions or failings of character, leaving me not only alone in my awareness of the truth, but actively pressured to forgive in a performance that served their comfort rather than justice. And I realized that the demand for forgiveness was never about healing or moral balance. It was about preserving an image of unity that had never existed and suppressing the chaos that Mark had deliberately cultivated with a precision that now seemed almost surgical. I sat through family dinners where laughter was strained, conversation was curated, and every compliment toward Mark was a blade disguised as affection, and I noticed how effortlessly he navigated the terrain, offering assistance, humor, and insight at moments calculated to make me doubt my own perceptions, to make me wonder if I was imagining the pattern, if my anger was misplaced, if my sense of violation was a private obsession that no one else needed to validate. And the realization that they were all acting in concert, that they had rehearsed forgiveness, as if it were a play in which I was both audience and reluctant participant, sparked a quiet fury that I knew needed direction. A strategy that would allow me to reclaim agency without resorting to the bluntness that would be dismissed as anger or hysteria. It was during one of these orchestrated moments, as his mother leaned close to whisper assurances about family and Mark's intentions, that I noticed the watch on his wrist, the one Evan had left behind when he deployed, polished and carefully placed. And it struck me that every token, every gesture, every minor possession had been manipulated to signal loyalty and presence while simultaneously erasing Evan's place, and in that moment I understood that any outward act of reconciliation I might perform would have to be deliberate, strategic, and exacting, a display of grace that carried consequences hidden beneath the surface, a form of justice that could only be revealed in its own time and on its own terms. And I began to craft the plan with meticulous attention to detail, knowing that timing, perception, and the illusion of forgiveness were my only allies in a household that had become a battlefield masked by civility. I engaged with them with measured smiles, nods, and a tone of compliance that concealed a mind working rapidly through the layers of deceit and opportunity, presenting the appearance of acceptance while documenting every inconsistency, every misstep, every instance of overreach, knowing that the culmination of my response had to be subtle enough to avoid suspicion yet powerful enough to dismantle the illusion of control Mark and the family believed they held. And I discovered an unexpected satisfaction in the art of waiting, of allowing their assumptions to guide them into the exact position I needed them to occupy, all while maintaining the outward demeanor of a woman committed to family values, patience, and forgiveness, which made the eventual revelation of truth all the more devastating because it would emerge not as an act of anger, but as a demonstration of precision, foresight, and the consequences of their complicity. A reckoning they had neither anticipated nor deserved. And the quiet confidence I felt in that strategy was reinforced each time they praised Mark for his attentiveness, each time they urged me to let go, each time they suggested that my resentment would only poison the family. Because I knew that the seeds of their collapse had been planted long before and only awaited the moment of harvest that I intended to orchestrate with the patience and clarity that betrayal had forced me to cultivate. By the end of the week, I had positioned myself carefully within the household, navigating the demands of civility while preparing the instruments of exposure, understanding that every interaction, every gesture, and every compliance would be used not as evidence of submission but as camouflage for the truth I was gathering. And as I watched Mark move through the rooms with the assumed authority of a man who had stolen not just a home, but a narrative, I felt the first flicker of certainty that the reckoning was within reach, that forgiveness could be delivered in a form that preserved my dignity while dismantling the pretense of his dominance, and I began to imagine the moment when all of their assumptions would collapse, leaving them to confront the consequences of a betrayal they had celebrated, protected, and encouraged. And in that moment, I understood fully that patience, precision, and the careful orchestration of perception were far more powerful than anger alone. And that my ultimate satisfaction would not come from confrontation, but from the inevitability of revelation. The day I decided to act, the house was bathed in the late afternoon light that stretched across the hardwood floors and turned ordinary objects into instruments of exposure. And I moved through each room with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in private for weeks, knowing that the appearance of compliance was the most effective weapon in a house built on deception, because when people believe you have surrendered, they lower their defenses, reveal their intentions, and leave traces of guilt and arrogance that can be harvested for justice without the need for confrontation. And in that understanding, I found the clarity I had been seeking for months while the walls of my life had been reshaped around Mark's intrusion and my family's indifference, and I realized that my revenge would not be dramatic, it would not be loud, but it would be precise, measured, and unavoidable in its consequences. I began with documentation, collecting every message, every casual comment, every subtle manipulation that Mark had executed in my absence, including the texts to his mother praising his attentiveness, the careless admissions to neighbors that hinted at impropriety, the quiet insinuations made in group chats that painted me as unreasonable, and the proof of the emotional usurpation that had been orchestrated to isolate me from Evan while maintaining the appearance of care. And I arranged the evidence meticulously, understanding that presentation was as important as substance, because the family's trust in appearances had been their blind spot. And the strategy relied entirely on their failure to consider that someone they had underestimated could wield patience, intelligence, and forethought as weapons more powerful than rage. Once I had compiled the evidence, I reached out to a contact within Evan's military network, someone with the capacity to investigate claims of impersonation, manipulation, and misuse of veteran benefits. And I sent the carefully documented messages, presenting them not as accusations born of anger, but as evidence of the systemic misuse of trust and authority, and I watched as the first responses arrived in careful, bureaucratic language that suggested immediate review and investigation, and for the first time in months, I felt the tension that had gripped me loosen slightly, because I knew that a process had been set in motion that would force Mark and the family to confront the consequences of their actions without the need for me to raise my voice or compromise my dignity. As I prepared for the family gathering that weekend, I rehearsed my demeanor, maintaining a calm exterior, the appearance of a woman who had forgiven, who was willing to accept the conventions of family reconciliation, while internally cataloging each opportunity to expose deception and entitlement, ensuring that each step I took, each word I spoke, contributed to the narrative that would culminate in revelation. And when the gathering began, I observed carefully, noting the subtle movements, the overconfident glances, the unguarded comments that indicated both Mark's assumptions of impunity and his parents' complicity, and I allowed myself to smile gently, a smile that concealed a mind working with precision, calculating the exact moment when the illusion would collapse and the truth would surface in a manner that left no room for misinterpretation. Mark arrived in his usual confident manner, greeting me with a familiarity that he believed I had accepted, and his parents followed with the smiles and reassurances of a family that assumed unity had been restored. And I listened as they spoke of past events, their words loaded with the expectation that forgiveness was inevitable, that compliance was the measure of morality, that I would subordinate my awareness of manipulation to the comfort of their narrative. And I allowed them to proceed, nodding, engaging in the cadence of ordinary conversation while feeling the anticipation of exposure building like a quiet storm, knowing that when the right moment came, the combination of evidence, process, and perception would render their assumptions obsolete, their authority undermined, and their control illusory. The culmination arrived with quiet inevitability. As they conversed about family obligations, Mark's phone buzzed with notifications that he believed were trivial, and when he glanced down, the investigation alerts from the military network appeared, indicating a formal review of his actions and a request for clarification on his use of his brother's identity, his privileges, and his claims. and the color drained from his face as he understood the reach of the consequences he had never anticipated, and when Evan, summoned by the same investigation, stepped into the room, the shock, the disbelief, and the realization of betrayal converged in a moment of clarity that no manipulation could erase, and the parents, unable to reconcile their assumptions with the evidence, turned their eyes to me, searching for explanations, forgiveness, or reprieve, and found only measured composure and quiet vindication, a presence that spoke more loudly than accusations ever could. As the house emptied, and the family confronted the fallout of their complicity, I understood fully the power of calculated patience, strategic observation, and the orchestration of truth as a form of justice. And I walked away with the certainty that forgiveness had been delivered in its purest form, not as a gift to them, but as a statement of agency, clarity, and moral authority, leaving behind a household transformed not by confrontation, but by the quiet inevitability of exposure. And as I closed the door, I knew that while the bonds of family had been tested and fractured, my own integrity, patience, and resolve had emerged intact, leaving room for reflection, for consequences, and for the ambiguous, yet satisfying closure I had long sought.